forbidden desire, unspeakable guilt, a vow broken by the sea. Welcome, dear listeners, to My Husband's Brother, an emotionally devastating saga perfect for fans of Bridgerton and Wuthering Heights. When a grieving widow finds solace in the arms of the one man she should never touch, her late husband's stoic, haunted brother, the memory of the dead threatens to drown their desperate, forbidden love. Will Lady Marianne Ashford and Captain James Ashford choose duty or the devastating truth of their hearts? Stay with us. This is a story that demands to be heard. And before we begin our journey into the windswept world of Seacrest, please like and subscribe so you don't miss a single wave of this turbulent romance. Part 1, The Widow by the Sea. The November gale possessed the fury of a spurned lover, howling across the coastline and hurling sheets of icy rain against the glass of Lady Marianne Ashford's drawing room windows. For 3 days, the storm had battered the family estate of Seacrest, and for 3 days, Marianne had stood sentinel at the narrow window in the west turret, her gaze fixed on the turbulent gray expanse of the North Sea. She was not merely observing the weather, she was watching for a miracle. On the 3rd day, the miracle did not arrive. Instead, a solemn man on a mud-splattered horse rode up the drive, bearing a letter whose official seal was as cold and hard as the rain that instantly dissolved the wax. Marianne received the news with a stillness that was unnerving even to Eleanor, her maid and longtime confidant. Her husband, Captain Edward Ashford, had been lost at sea. His vessel, the frigate Ariadne, had met with disaster off the coast of Brittany. There were no survivors, only wreckage. Marianne felt the life drain from the world not as a sudden, violent wrench, but as the slow, inexorable ebbing of a tide. The vibrant, laughing woman she had been 2 years ago, the girl who had been so innocently delighted to marry the dashing, good-natured Edward, was instantly shrouded, her future swallowed by the oppressive black crepe of mourning. In the immediate aftermath, there was a flurry of duty and distress telegrams. Lady Beatrice Ashford, Edward's mother, arrived from London in a state of rigid aristocratic grief, clutching her pearls and speaking only of the propriety of the funeral arrangements. "You must be strong, Marianne," Lady Beatrice declared, her voice a thin, brittle command, "for the honor of the family. We must not give the village anything to whisper about." Marianne heard the words, yet they failed to penetrate the dense fog that now enveloped her soul. Edward's memory was the only beacon she possessed. She remembered the lightness of his hand in hers, the careless joy of his smile, the way he had filled the manor with a bustling, happy noise. Now Seacrest was a monument to silence, vast and echoic. She retreated to the seaside estate, choosing to remain in the house that had been her marital home, rather than face the suffocating sympathy of London society. She walked the cliffs daily, the fierce wind a physical counterpoint to the quiet ache in her chest. She found solace only in the endless, restless movement of the ocean, the same ocean that had stolen him away. The second arrival at Seacrest was wholly different. A week after the news, Captain James Ashford, Edward's elder brother, returned. James did not arrive with the flurry of activity or the crisp uniform Edward had always favored. He came quietly, disembarking from a local fishing boat at the small cove below the house. He was dressed in a dark, serviceable coat that seemed to absorb the light, and his face was etched with a grim, almost punishing seriousness. At 32, James was everything Edward was not. 6 years his brother's senior, a career naval officer who rarely smiled, possessed of a stoic reserve that kept the world at arm's length. He was handsome in a severe, unyielding way, his brow perpetually furrowed, his eyes the color of a stormy, deep, gray sea, the kind of eyes that saw too much and confessed nothing. Marianne encountered him in the library late that first evening. She had sought the quiet of the room, hoping to find a fragment of comfort in Edward's favorite armchair. James was standing before the mantel, staring at Edward's portrait, a brightly colored likeness of a man who looked impossibly vital and young. He did not startle when she entered. He merely turned, his gaze sweeping over her black gown and the pale, fragile skin of her face. "Marianne." His voice was a low, gravelly sound, rougher than she remembered. It sounded as though every word was difficult to pull from his throat. "James," she replied, stepping toward him, I did not expect you so soon." "I was at Portsmouth. The Admiralty dispatched me immediately to see to Edward's affairs." He did not speak of comfort or condolence. He spoke of duty, of logistics, of the stark reality that Edward's life now needed to be neatly packed away into ledgers and legal documents. He looked at her, and the distance in his eyes briefly fractured. "You are too thin. You should be in bed, not haunting this cold room." "I am fine," she murmured defensively. "It is the sea that comforts me now. The quiet." James said nothing to this, but she saw a flicker of raw pain in his expression, a fleeting, dangerous confession of feeling he instantly suppressed. His hand moved to the mantel, and his thumb brushed the cold marble just inches from Edward's bronze desk clock. Edward had always worshipped James, holding him up as the model of what a man should be, disciplined, noble, and fiercely intelligent. Yet, James had always worn Edward's adoration with a kind of heavy, unsuited burden. As he began to speak of the late Captain Edward Ashford's will and the difficult, necessary task of sorting through his papers, Marianne found her gaze drawn to him. In James, she saw a profound and terrible echo of her lost husband. They shared the same high cheekbones, the same proud set of the shoulders, the same blood. But the echo was corrupted. Where Edward was warm and quick to laugh, James was ice and shadow. Edward's presence had been a comfort. James's presence was a disquieting intensity, a quiet force that seemed to pull the very air out of the room. And yet, as James spoke, she began to notice something else. He was a mirror reflecting a deeper, older longing she had foolishly buried beneath the surface of her marriage. The discipline that held his grief captive, the tightly coiled tension in his broad frame, the way his gray eyes assessed every object in the room. It was all devastatingly compelling. He was the brother she should lean on for support. He was the safe harbor she must navigate this storm of sorrow with. But even in this first desolate meeting, Marianne realized he was something far more dangerous. He was the echo of what she'd lost. Yes, but he was also the vivid, undeniable call of what she still, impossibly, yearned for. The man who stood before her, Edward's brother and her dutiful protector, was the only man she should never allow herself to love. And as the storm raged on outside, sealing them within the melancholy walls of Seacrest, Lady Marianne Ashford felt the very first forbidden stirrings of a desire that would either break her completely or shatter the cold stone that encased her heart. Part 2. The Brother's Promise. The winter settled upon Seacrest, mirroring the cold and weighty mantle that lay upon the house and its occupants. Captain James Ashford, intending only a brief stay to execute his late brother's will and settle the estate's immediate debts, found himself unable to leave. The unspoken promise he had made to Edward, a vow to look after Marianne, now felt less like a duty and more like a tether, binding him to the windswept estate. He moved through the house with the precise, methodical discipline of a naval man, but his efforts were rooted not in paperwork, but in grief. He began fixing things. Edward had been a man of grand schemes and little attention to maintenance. James, with his capable, sea-hardened hands, repaired the broken latch on the drawing-room window that rattled incessantly in the gales. He painstakingly mended the delicate porcelain shepherdess Edward had carelessly chipped months ago. Most poignantly, he took on the task of clearing Edward's study, sorting through charts and logbooks, a duty that Lady Beatrice had declared too emotionally taxing for anyone but a son. Marianne watched him from a distance at first, observing the controlled violence of his movements as he wrestled with the lock on Edward's old campaign chest. He was a man accustomed to command, to battle, to tangible tasks, and it seemed he was directing all his desperate, contained anguish into these physical acts. Their interactions became routine, small, domestic things carried out under the vast, echoing roof of the manor. She would find him late at night, slumped over a ledger, and bring him a cup of tea, a ritual that demanded no words, only a moment of silent, acknowledged shared sorrow. The genuine, unspoken bond formed not over Edward's memory, but over the raw, present fact of his absence. One crisp afternoon, James convinced Marianne to join him on the cliffs. "It is good to breathe the air, Marianne," he commanded softly, holding out a thick woolen shawl. "You must not become a ghost in this house." They walked the treacherous, familiar paths, the rhythmic sound of the waves below, a constant presence. They spoke of ships, of the sea, and of everything but Edward. James spoke of navigation, the stars, the hard, noble simplicity of life at sea, and for a short, stolen time, Marianne's mind lifted from the black gauze of mourning. It was during these walks that the unspoken tension began to hum. James would instinctively reach out when the wind threatened to pull her off balance, his hand finding the small of her back, a touch that was instantaneous and functional, yet lingered for a fraction of a second too long. When he turned to address her, the closeness of his body, the scent of sea salt and wool and something uniquely him, would make her breath catch. Once returning to the house as dusk painted the sky in shades of bruised violet and gray, Marianne paused to look back at the cove. James stopped behind her. She did not need to turn to know how close he stood. The wind caught a stray lock of her hair and whipped it across her face. James, with a gentle suddenness, reached out and tucked the strand behind her ear. His fingers brushed her cheek. It was a minuscule contact, a breath of movement, yet the effect was electric. Their eyes met, and in that held glance, the air between them thickened, the shared grief turning into a complex, forbidden heat. In his stormy gray eyes, Marianne saw not the shadow of Edward, but James himself, a man wounded and intensely alive. James pulled his hand back as if burned, his jaw clenching, and without a word, he strode ahead toward the house, leaving Marianne to follow, her heart pounding a furious, erratic rhythm against her ribs. The incident served as a stark reminder of the boundary they dared not cross, reinforcing the propriety that James in particular clung to. Yet the currents of emotion were too strong to be fully contained. One blustery evening, a local fisherman brought a sodden canvas bag to the manor. It had been recovered days earlier and far up the coast, lost wreckage finally relinquished by the sea. Inside, miraculously preserved due to the oilskin wrapping, were Edward's journals and a stack of personal letters, confessions and thoughts Edward had set down during his last voyage. Marianne and James carried the bag to the drawing room. The fire cast dancing shadows, and the scent of damp leather and salt filled the air. They sat on the floor, side by side, reverently unfolding the stiff, dried pages. They began to read them together, a shared, intimate communion with the ghost of Edward. Edward wrote of the ship, of the weather, and of his deep, simple love for Marianne. "I dream of your laugh, my dearest wife," one letter read, "and of the peace I find only when my ship is sailing toward Seacrest." But then the tone shifted. In a letter dated just a week before his ship was lost, Edward wrote of his growing anxieties, of a dangerous mission he'd been ordered to undertake, and of a reckless command decision that James, his elder brother and superior officer, had warned him against. The joy of their shared memory fractured. Edward's anxieties revealed a vulnerability that neither James nor Marianne had fully comprehended. As they reached the final page, the words became more disjointed, imbued with a desperate fear of failure and the dark water outside his cabin window. James's hand trembled as he held the last page, his face a mask of terrible self-reproach. "He was afraid, Marianne," James whispered, the stoicism finally cracking. "I told him not to take that course. I warned him. But he was so driven to prove himself." He stopped, unable to voice the thought. Driven to prove himself worthy of my name, worthy of command. Marianne looked not at the letter, but at the strong, tortured profile of the man beside her. The shared ache of loss was suddenly intensified, turning into a profound, mutual burden. James was drowning in the guilt of what he believed was his failure to save his little brother. She reached out, her hand settling gently on his rigid arm. "James, you cannot take the ocean's blame upon yourself." "But I can take his blame," he replied, his voice rough with unshed tears. "He wrote that he regretted defying my counsel. He trusted me, and I was not there." In that moment of shared devastation, the boundary dissolved. The loss had brought them together, but the shame threatened to push him away forever. In comforting him, in trying to soothe the raw edges of his guilt, Marianne felt a shocking wave of clarity. The ache of losing Edward was still there, but her heart was no longer an empty tomb. It had begun to heal, slowly, painfully, and the healing was wrapping itself entirely around the figure of the man who sat beside her. She had mistaken the source of her comfort. It was not Edward's memory that sustained her, but James's steady, wounded presence. The tension that hummed between them intensified beyond mere longing. It became a desperate, immediate need for solace and connection. The firelight flickered, illuminating the tears on James's cheek, and as he turned his gaze toward her, all the disciplined reserve of the naval captain vanished, replaced by the naked, forbidden desire of a man who had lost everything but the woman sitting 3 inches away from him. The ache of loss, they both knew, was about to transform into something neither could honor, neither could name, and neither could, with certainty, withstand.
We were so close.
Part 3. Whispers in the Storm. The fragile equilibrium James and Marianne had established, a tense truce between duty and desire, was violently shattered by the arrival of a second, more formal dispatch from the Admiralty. Unlike the first brief notice of loss, this one contained official findings concerning the sinking of the Ariadne. The seal was broken by James, who read the document in the library, standing rigid before the cold grate of the fireplace. Marianne sat nearby, stitching an unnecessary seam in a handkerchief, pretending to be absorbed in her work. When James finally spoke, his voice was a chilling monotone. "It was not a storm, Marianne," he said, his eyes fixed on the paper, as if the words there were searing into his mind. "Not merely weather. The Admiralty suspects negligence, or perhaps recklessness. Edward took a route he was expressly ordered to avoid. There are suggestions that the cargo and the speed he attempted to maintain rendered the vessel vulnerable." He crumpled the paper in his fist, the sound sharp and brutal. "And I was the one who commanded the Ariadne's sister ship. I was the one who was meant to sail with him, to guide him." He turned, his face a landscape of terrible self-condemnation. "I was the commanding officer on that entire operation. I ordered the deployment. I knew the dangers of that specific passage. Edward was trying to prove himself to me, to his family, to the service, and he died doing it." Guilt consumed James, a palpable, heavy presence in the room. He did not merely feel regret, he felt criminally responsible. He saw Edward's death not as an accident of the sea, but as the consequence of his own perceived failure to mentor, to protect, to save. "I killed him, Marianne," he whispered, the words ragged and torn. "If I had enforced the letter of the law, if I had simply been a harder, colder brother to him." Marianne rose immediately, dropping her needlework. Horror mixed with a profound compassion flooded her. The image of the stoic Captain James Ashford, the man of granite discipline, dissolving into this tormented figure was unbearable. "Stop," she pleaded, stepping toward him. "You will not say such a monstrous thing." "It is the truth," he insisted, backing away, a desperation in his eyes to escape her proximity. "I am bound to duty, bound to Edward. This guilt is my penance." Marianne followed him, her steps measured, her gaze unwavering. "Your duty is to the living, James. Edward made his own choices. You cannot, you must not, shoulder the full weight of the ocean, the Admiralty, and your brother's ambition. That is not atonement. That is a descent into darkness." She reached out and laid her hands on his chest, right over his fiercely beating heart. Her touch was not seductive, but firm, grounding, and absolutely truthful. "If you fall, James, who will be left? I am here. We grieve together." In that moment, he saw her not as his brother's widow, not as a memory, but as a woman of quiet, formidable strength. She was refusing to allow him the escape of self-flagellation, forcing him to remain tethered to the world, to her. In doing so, she was not just comforting him, she was beginning to heal the terrible wound in his soul. And in the strength of her touch, she realized that the fragile remnants of her heart had utterly healed around him. Her love for Edward was a fond, gentle remembrance. Her feeling for James was a desperate, immediate necessity. That evening, a storm of legendary severity swept over the coast. It was the kind of gale that felt biblical, shaking the ancient foundation of Seacrest, plunging the house into darkness when a lightning strike downed the power lines. James and Marianne were trapped in the drawing room, the roaring wind and rain sealing them in a small, flickering world illuminated only by the fire and a single oil lamp. Eleanor, the maid, was terrified and had retreated to the kitchens. Lady Beatrice, upstairs, was barricaded in her room, demanding quiet no one could provide. They spoke little. The storm's fury seemed to demand silence, allowing the intense, devastating intimacy between them to flourish without the need for words. James tended the fire, his profile sharp against the shadows. Marianne watched him, seeing the taut muscle of his shoulders, the strain in his posture. The wind suddenly tore at a weakened window pane, sending a splintering crack through the room. James moved instantly, his command training taking over. Stay back, he ordered, rushing to secure the large velvet curtains. He struggled against the wind, pushing through the crack, wrestling the heavy material into place. Marianne rushed forward, not to help with the curtains, but to secure the heavy bronze statuette on the mantelpiece that rattled precariously. As she stepped away from the mantel, James turned, blinded for a moment by the darkness and the lamp's sudden flicker. He collided with her, not gently, but with the sudden, jarring force of his entire body. Marianne gasped, catching her balance with hands pressed hard against his chest. His hands wrapped around her waist, steadying her, and for a long, breath-stealing moment, they were pressed together, hip to hip, chest to chest, the fabric of her morning gown a thin barrier between them. The scent of him, sea air, leather, and rain, was overwhelming. The heat of his body was undeniable. Every instinct that told Marianne this is wrong was drowned out by the fierce, clamoring need that had been building between them for weeks. His head lowered. Her eyes fluttered shut. It was an inevitable trajectory, a force of nature as powerful and inescapable as the storm outside. She felt the warmth of his breath on her lips, tasted the sharp, metallic tang of the almost kiss. Then, with a shudder that vibrated through his entire frame, James abruptly pulled away. He released her as if she were made of fire, taking 3 staggering steps back until he hit the cold wall. His chest was heaving, his eyes wide with a horrified, self-loathing passion. "No," he choked out, the sound ripped from his throat. "Dear God, no." He didn't look at her, didn't dare meet her gaze. His eyes were fixed on the black square of the fireplace, fixed on the ghost of the brother he swore he would never betray. The near betrayal, the terrifying proximity to what he truly desired, was enough to shatter his composure entirely. He was horrified, repulsed by his own powerful, forbidden longing. Marianne stood rooted to the spot, trembling not from the cold or the storm, but from the brutal whiplash of rejection. The silence that fell between them was heavier than any gale, filled with the devastating knowledge that they both wanted what could never be, and that James, bound by a guilt as ancient and deep as the sea itself, would sacrifice his own heart and hers to honor a memory.
I cannot do this! James!
Please.
The storm has passed, but the air at Seacrest remains dangerously charged. Captain James Ashford has tasted the exquisite betrayal of his desire, a moment that has left him horrified by his own longing. Lady Marianne, having offered comfort, now understands the true, desperate nature of her healing heart. The line has been drawn, but can it hold? You have just concluded part 1 of My Husband's Brother. The sea keeps its secrets, but the whispers are beginning. What happens when propriety discovers passion? Join us next time for part 2, where duty drives a man to the edge of the world, and a broken-hearted widow learns the true meaning of abandonment.